Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark, the servant who came to save. The Gospel, according to Mark, is called that because its author is John Mark. Notice he's got both a a Jewish name, John, or Yonain. You probably pronounce that a number of different ways. Jonathan is the old Hebrew form, and then Marcus is actually a Roman name, so he's got both a Jewish and a Latin name. He writes to the Gentiles, and maybe because of that, we don't call him John, we call him Mark. And so he used that Gentile name. Now, there's no genealogy at the beginning of Mark. There's only a single quote from the Old Testament. There are going to be a great many allusions, so that we, with our Old Testament background, will read through it and we will see that, and we'll be looking at some of those in just a moment. But the original readers might not have had that insight. Although, to be fair, there were quite a number of Jewish people in Rome. So many so that Claudius, in his day, the Emperor Claudius, actually said, "That's it. I've heard enough complaints from the Jewish people. All Jewish people out of Italy." And you'll remember that Acts chapter 18 actually references that. Now, this is the shortest of the four Gospels by quite a bit. It's actually a very short epistle. It's known for its short and yet vivid details. It's streamlined and yet not at the expense of giving some very specific details. It talks about how the story of the rich young ruler, which the other Matthew and Luke both mention, but here in Mark we find out that Jesus loved him. At the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus had the people sit in groups of hundreds and fifties. We have somebody at the arrest of Jesus. There's an instance there where he had been being arrested, and there's some man who was there, clothed in linen. We're not told who his name was. And there in the darkness, the authorities that are arresting Jesus seek to grab this man. They grab, and he runs away, leaving his linen garment behind. So running away through the darkness, apparently naked. And Mark's the only one that mentions that. And we wonder, why did he even include that? There have been some who thought, goodness, maybe that was Mark himself. Now, I'm not willing to go that far. I think there might be some reasons why that little detail is added. We have the names of the sons of Simon of Cyrene, the person who was enlisted to help carry the cross of Jesus. And we read about his sons by name, which perhaps hints that by the time that this is written, not only Simon of Cyrene, but maybe his two sons have become Christians, and so their names might be familiar to the recipients of this book. Now, when we compare Matthew and Mark, Matthew is an eyewitness to the life and ministry of Jesus. Mark does not claim to be an eyewitness. Rather, tradition tells us that he is associated with both the apostles Peter and Paul. Remember, he traveled with Paul on his first missionary journey. And at the end of Paul's life, he actually is writing to Timothy, and he says, "I want you to come to me before I die, and I want you to bring Mark with you." So there's some associations there. Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. Mark, I'm going to suggest, is written to a Latin audience. Even though it's written in Greek, it's written with some elements that make it more inviting to a Roman audience. Matthew presents Jesus as a king. Mark presents Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, but as in servant terms. And so we're going to see a servant emphasis in Mark. Matthew is going to focus on the sermons of Jesus. Mark will focus on the miracles of Jesus. Now, I said that Mark has an emphasis on Jesus as a servant. And because of that, we note that Mark has no reference to a genealogy, because you don't need to know about the genealogy or the birth of a servant. You just need to know about what a servant does. And so the narrative in Mark begins with the ministry, the action ministry of Jesus. There's only two sermons of Jesus that are given. One early in the book, one will be toward the end, where we're going to see the Olivet Discourse. So we have the parables of the kingdom, that's going to be chapter 4, and the Olivet Discourse will be chapter 13. Some key words and phrases. You don't think of the word immediately as a key word or phrase. I include this because it is used so often by Mark. Sometimes I want to say, in the words of an old action movie, do you really think that word means what you think it means? It just, you seem to be using it so often. And Mark uses that term immediately so much that we're almost out of breath when we finish reading his epistle. And the word and you'd think, really, you're including the word and? That's true. And in that, Mark is perhaps borrowing from the style of the Old Testament, especially the Torah. If you've ever read Genesis through Deuteronomy in the old King James, and the reason I mention the King James is because it captures that regular use in the Hebrew of the word and. It's a common use in Hebrew and especially in the Torah, and Mark has that as well. There's also a regular use of what is called the historic present. Now, this won't come out in our English translations because our English translations usually have been very careful to sort of gloss over and make it easier reading for us English speakers. But think about this. When you tell a story, oftentimes you will tell a story if you want your listener to imagine that he's in it. You will tell it in the present tense. I can tell a joke. I'm not going to go through the punchline, but a priest, a rabbi, and a Baptist minister walk into a bar and they each ask for a drink. And notice already I've been describing that action, not in the past, not like they walked in the past, but they walk present tense. And that's a device that we use to get the hearer into the action. And Mark does that a lot. He does that regularly. Matthew, notice, and I'm borrowing some of these, don't even remember where I picked them up. Matthew begins with a genealogy. Notice how it says, before I begin, let me give you the genealogy of Jesus so you will know this is about a real person. And Matthew does that. He starts, of course, he's speaking to Jewish people, so he starts with the genealogy. Luke, before I begin, let me tell you of the backstory that led up to all of this. And Luke begins with a birth narrative, and it's not even the birth of Jesus initially, it's the birth of John the Baptist, and it's a very long story. And then you get the birth of Jesus, and then you finally get to the life and ministry of Jesus. When we get to the Gospel of John, notice how he says, before I begin, let me explain why it's important to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And John starts off, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all of these things that sort of set the theology up of who is Jesus. Now, in contrast to all of those, we have Mark, and notice the Greek word there, outhos. That's the word immediately. Mark jumps right into the action. He will have an opening verse that gives a little bit of a title, but then right after that, immediately after that, he begins with the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, when we look at Mark, as I said, there's not going to be a lot of Old Testament quotations where Mark himself is quoting the Old Testament and saying, this is a quote from such and such a place. But that does not mean that Mark is unconnected to the Old Testament. And so we're going to see a great many analogies. For example, Jesus in Mark chapter 1 is in the wilderness for 40 days, and you had Moses and Elijah, each of who had a 40-day experience. And so that reminds us of something that took place in the Old Testament. Mark describes this story in chapter 1, verse 24 about an unclean spirit. And the unclean spirit says, what business do we have with each other? Have you come to destroy us? And the Phoenician widow in the days of Elijah, remember, asks Elijah, what do I have to do with you? Have you come to put my son to death? In Mark chapter 2, we're going to read about the paralytic, the paralyzed man, being lowered through the roof so that Jesus can heal him. And he points out the faith of the men who were doing the action. In the Old Testament, we had King Ahaziah fall through the roof and inquire from the pagan gods. And Elijah sends in, what are you doing asking those pagan gods? Where is your faith? Now, notice I mentioned Moses and Elijah, but early on, I'm focusing on how Mark reminds us a great deal of the Elijah story. We continue. The disciples of Jesus pick grain to eat on the Sabbath, and we have David and his companions who eat consecrated bread from the high priest, 1 Samuel chapter 21. In Mark, we have Jesus appointing 12 to be sent out, and Moses chooses 12 spies and sends them out. In Mark, Jesus is asleep in the boat, and he's awakened, and he stills the storm, and Jonah is asleep in the boat, and he's awakened, and of course he's thrown overboard before the storm is stilled, but the storm is stilled. In Mark, we have Jesus casting out a legion of demons into swine, and they run down into the sea and are drowned. And Moses casts the armies of the Pharaoh into the Red Sea, where they are drowned. In the Mark story, Jesus comes to raise up the daughter of Jairus, and Elisha comes to raise the son of the Shunammite. In Mark, Jesus tells his disciples not to take money or 2 cloaks, and Elisha's servant Gehazi, there's a story where he takes silver and 2 cloaks, and of course he's not supposed to do that. He gets punished for that. In Mark's story, we have Herod Antipas and Herodias, who are pitted against John the Baptist and bringing about his death. In the Elijah story, we have Ahab and Jezebel, who are pitted against Elijah and even threatening them with death. In the Mark story, Jesus multiplies bread and fish for 5,000, and there are 12 baskets left over. In the Elisha story, he multiplies 20 loaves of bread and grain for 100 men, and there's some leftovers at the end. We read in Mark about Herod Antipas granting the request to have John the Baptist beheaded. Then that's followed by the feeding of the 5,000, and you have the scene of the disciples in the boat, and they're walking on the sea, and the Pharisees, they take issue with the disciples and their unwashed hands. Then later on, as the story continues, and I want you to notice how there's sort of an interesting parallel in Mark itself, not with the Old Testament, but in itself, where we'd had Herod Antipas grant a request. Now Jesus grants a request to heal the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman. There had been feeding of the 5,000. Now there's feeding of the 4,000. There had been an incident with a boat. Now there's another incident with a boat. The Pharisees had taken issues. And again, Jesus speaks about beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. So even within itself, there's a certain amount of repetition that takes place in this short little book. Now we come to our outline. I've given you some just scattered observations. We can actually divide the Gospel of Mark into 2 basic sections, chapters 1 through 8, and notice I'm going halfway through chapter 8, the service of the servant, that is what the servant does, and then beginning halfway through chapter 8, and there's going to be a pivotal point there, the suffering of the servant. So that I begin with an introduction. Not that it's that big. The word introduction is sort of big, so it had to take up some space here. And very briefly, we're told about the baptism of Jesus, the ministry of John the Baptist. And then I have the public ministry of Jesus. The pivotal point takes place when Jesus asks his disciples, and they say, now in Matthew we're told it's Peter, but in Mark, they say, "You are the Christ." And up to now, you've been seeing Jesus at work. You were introduced with a verse that told you this is the Christ, the Son of God, or the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus the Christ. But now they come to the realization you are the Christ, and now you have a focus more on the private ministry of Jesus, where he is teaching his disciples. That's not to say that the public is never there, but now it's much more private as they are headed to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will have the death, the burial, and the resurrection, which is really the same with all 4 Gospels. So notice we have the suffering of the servant, the service of the servant, and the suffering of the servant. Now, in that first half, there's the rising action, and the question there, who is Jesus? And it's culminated in that statement, you are the Christ. And then after that, we could have what we call the falling action. And really the focus here is, what did he come to accomplish? How he came as the servant, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And so the parables, and remember that first sermon that we saw has parables in it. The second sermon will be the Olivet Discourse that will look toward both the present but also the future in its focus. Here's the passage I just mentioned, Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. I think this is perhaps the key passage in the Gospel of Mark. And calling them to himself, remember he's speaking mostly to his disciples here, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your," here's the key word, "your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even," here, and here it is, verse 45, "for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Those words, servant, to serve, that is why Jesus came. He came to serve, and he came to serve by dying in our place. Now, a comparison between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These three Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they present Jesus in roughly the same way. John's going to be in sort of a class by itself. So Matthew's an eyewitness of the life and ministry of Jesus. Mark and Luke both are associated with the apostles, either Peter or Paul. In Matthew's case, he writes to Jews. Mark and Luke write to Gentiles as what seemed to be their immediate audience. Doesn't mean Jewish people can't read it, but the focus is upon a wider, more Gentile audience. Mark, I think, writes to Romans. Luke writes to just other Gentiles, Romans included. In Matthew's case, Jesus is presented as king. We've seen that. Jesus is presented as a servant. And I would suggest that Luke presents Jesus as a teacher and storyteller. The long story parables are going to be in Luke. Matthew has his focus on the sermons of Jesus. Mark focuses, he does have a couple sermons, but he focuses more on the miracles of Jesus. And Luke focuses upon the teaching and especially the parables, those long story parables of Jesus. Now, Mark chapter 14 and verse 3. We read, "While he was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper and reclining at the table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she broke," and notice I've capitalized or boldened the words, she broke the vial and poured it over his head. Notice those words that are specific to Mark. He really points that out. And then a bit later, we're going to read at the Last Supper, where after a blessing, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and gave it to them and said, that, "Take, this is my body." And then verse 24, he takes the cup and he says, "This is the blood of my covenant, which is poured out for many." I don't think it's any mistake that Mark described about how the vial was broken and poured, because that's going to be a picture that's repeated later on as Jesus gives his Last Supper. The body is broken and the blood is poured. And John wants you to capture that. I'm sorry, Mark wants you to capture that. Now, I noted already, I made mention of this, that in Mark chapter 14, verse 51, at the arrest of Jesus, there's a young man who is following him wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. And you wonder, why is that story told? It might be that Mark was there, but there might be another reason too. It might remind you of a time back at the very fall of mankind, where there was some nakedness involved in a garden. See, there's perhaps a Jewish allusion from the Old Testament. Now we want to look at the Jewish trial. The trial takes place in the courtyard of the high priest, and the whole council is there. You read about false testimony. When we put all four of the Gospels together, we actually end up with 6 trials, but they are merged together here. So we read that they are questioning, and there's a questioning of the high priest and Peter. And then we come in Mark 15, verse 1, to the Roman trial. Now, again, Mark is going to see the Roman trial, all one trial. He's not going to talk about Jesus being before Pilate, and then Herod Antipas, and then Pontius Pilate. He's just going to put all that together here. Early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders and scribes and the whole council, immediately held a consultation and binding Jesus. If you want, you can see that as another Jewish trial. But they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And there is before Pilate an initial questioning where Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered and says, "It is as you say." The chief priest began to accuse him harshly, and then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. And then you have this Barabbas incident, verse 6. Now at the feast he used to, that is, Pilate used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested, and the man named Barabbas, and it's an interesting name, Bar-Abbas, Abba means father, in Aramaic at least, and Bar is the Aramaic word for son. So this is the son of a father. We could almost describe it as like any man. The man named Barabbas, I think, by the way, his name really was that, but maybe it's significant too, had been imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. There had been a revolt. It hadn't gone very far, but in that revolt, Barabbas had been arrested. And the crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them, that is, release somebody. Verse 9, Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. And so Pilate's gotten the idea that it's not, Jesus hasn't done anything wrong. There's just a jealousy factor that's involved here. Verse 11, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. And stirred up the crowd is going to go for it. Answering again, Pilate said to them, "What then what shall I do with him who you call the king of the Jews?" Notice how he's being a little insulting. But notice we're going to pick up on that. We're going to follow that through in just a moment. They shouted back, "Crucify him." But Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" And notice they don't answer with what evil has he done. They shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed them over to be crucified. Now, before we go any further, I need to pause and speak to you about the Roman triumph. You see, the Romans, once their emperor would come back, and initially triumphs had been given to Roman generals, but after Julius Caesar and Octavius Augustus had become emperors, from this time on, triumphs were only accorded to Roman emperors. Another general might, they might say, "Well done," but the honor of a triumph was exclusive to them. And a triumph was a tumultuous parade that took the emperor, the victorious emperor, through the city. You would have him on a chariot, and behind him there would be all the peoples that were coming to honor him. It would be a great parade, and it would move through the city to give him the honor of his triumph. It would begin with the Praetorian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the Roman emperor, who would gather to him early that morning. They would dress him in purple. Now, purple was reserved for usually for kings, and emperors did not take the title of king. That was not a good thing for the Romans. The Romans had actually fought a war many hundreds of years earlier to get rid of all their kings. But on this day only, the one benefiting from the triumph would be allowed to be dressed in purple. And then they would take a victory wreath, and they would place the victory wreath upon his head. So he's dressed in purple, the victory wreath, the guard has gathered around him. They would acclaim him with titles of honor. stopping short maybe at king, although Julius Caesar, when he had been accorded triumph, Mark Antony had said, "Let's proclaim him a king," and Caesar said, "No, no, don't do that." And I think secretly he might have wanted it, but he maybe protested a bit too much. But they did acclaim him honor, and they gave him wonderful titles. Next would bring the procession, and the procession would bring him through the city, and it would come all the way up to Capitoline Hill. Now, Capitoline Hill is one of the 7 hills on which the city of Rome was founded. It was called Capitoline. A capital, for example, if you have a big column, the very top of that column, the ornate part of the top of the column, is called the capital. And a capital is just a word for head, the Latin word for head, or skull. And the hill had gotten its name, supposedly, that back when the city was first founded, on that hill, they had found a skull, a human skull, a human head. And so they would take him to Capitoline Hill, to Skull Hill. And once there, he would ascend the steps of the hill, and there he would be given a libation of wine that he would pour out. And he would stand there amidst his honored friends. His 2 most honored friends would stand on either side of him. And an inscription would be raised up listing his titles and all that he has accomplished, so that everyone could hear and give him praise. Finally, they would look for signs in the heavens. Legend had it that at the funeral of Julius Caesar, a comet had appeared in the sky for 7 days, announcing that this was somebody that was truly wonderful, that this was a son of God. And very oftentimes, the one enjoying the triumph would be given that title. We see examples where Octavius Augustus was given the title, the Son of God. Now, everything I've described is exactly how Mark tells us the story of Jesus going to the cross. We actually begin in Mark chapter 15 and verse 16. The soldiers took him away into the palace. That is the praetorium. It actually uses that term. And they dressed him in purple, verse 17, after twisting a crown of thorns. Notice, it's not a victory wreath, but it's still a crown of thorns. And they began to acclaim him, and they acclaim him with the title, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they take him in a procession through the city and outside the city gates to the place where they will crucify him, pressing into service Simon of Cyrene. And they bring him to the place, not Capitoline, but to the place Golgotha. And then, just in case we miss the significance, Mark actually translates it, which is translated place of a skull. Probably not because it looked like a skull, but there's a reference way back in 1 Samuel chapter 17 about how David had brought the skull of Goliath to Jerusalem. Maybe the place where he had left that skull. I don't know if that's the case or not. And so they crucify him. And while he is on the cross, they try, in chapter 15 and verse 23, they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he would not take it, the libation of wine. They crucified not 2 honored friends, but 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. And then we read that there is an inscription that is placed there that states who he is. Finally, there's a sign in the heavens, verse 33. When the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. And when Jesus finally dies, we read that a centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last and said, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." And the Roman readers are supposed to read this and hear it and make the connection and come to the same conclusion. Now, to show that that conclusion is indeed true, Mark is going to continue, as do Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Notice I put them here side by side. We're not going to do this all the way through, but Matthew starts off, now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Mark starts off when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, and Mary tells you who that other Mary was, the mother of James, and Salome, brought spices so they might come and anoint him. Luke says, but on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing spices. It says later on in Luke who they are. And so, again, with the synoptics, I have very much the same story told. But then continuing with Mark's version, very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb where the sun had risen, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, although it was extremely large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. John's account is going to talk about two angels. Mark only mentions one. Verse 6, he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said to you." Verse 8 then says, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Now, in two of the oldest manuscripts that we have, the Sinaiticus and another manuscript known as the Vaticanus, they are very old. They date to 4th, 5th century, somewhere in there. Oldest complete manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. We come to verse 8, and actually, we don't read any further. In both manuscripts, there's a big blank spot afterwards, and then you go either to the next column in one of those, or actually in the other, you actually have to turn the page, and you're into a new book of the New Testament. And so because of this, there a great many scholars think, well, gee, maybe Mark either ended his epistle or his gospel account right here, which is sort of odd. It's sort of an odd place to, and yet there are some Bible-believing scholars that believe that Mark he ended here on purpose, as if to say, look, here's the report, you decide what happened. So notice they've made reference to the resurrection. At the same time, there are some very early witnesses to the complete account, the one that you read in your Bible. And your Bible, if it's a study Bible, probably has a little footnote saying verses 9 and following to the end actually aren't in some of the earliest manuscripts. And that's true. However, there are some much earlier witnesses, earlier than those two manuscripts from which it is missing. Justin Martyr, an early church father. In fact, we usually refer to him as an apostolic father because he's in the next generation after the apostles. And he quotes from Mark chapter 16, verse 20, and refers to it as the fulfillment of Psalm 110 and verse 2. So he's actually making connections in Mark's account. And he's long before those two later, they're early, but they're much later than this, those two later copies of the Gospel of Mark. Likewise, Tatian, he's Justin's student, cites a passage in his Diatessaron. It's sort of an ancient harmony of the Gospels, and he's putting that together, again, long before the Sinaiticus or the Vaticanus. And he is familiar with that work and citing it. And then you have Irenaeus, still long before either of those two later manuscripts. He's quoting from Mark chapter 16, verse 19, and he's saying Mark said this. And so we have some earlier quotes from apostolic and early church fathers that cite the passage as being original. Now, Eusebius, by the time we get to the 300s, Eusebius comments on this, and he says, that short ending that comes up to verse 8, that's seen in most of the copies of Mark in his day, at least the copies with which he was familiar. So sometime between those very early church fathers, and by the time we get to the 300s, in and it probably started with just one gospel account where they lost the ending, and as copies were made, they didn't have those later verses, so the copies were absent. Now let's read this. My personal opinion, I could be wrong, my personal opinion, this was actually part of the gospel account. Now, after he had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and reported to those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping, and when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they refused to believe it. And after that, he appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking along on their way to the country. And they went away and reported it to the others, but they did not believe them either. So notice the previous verse, that's echoed from the Gospel of John. This is echoed in Peter's Gospel account. Verse 14, and afterward he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at the table, and he reproached them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. We have this recorded in John. John actually tells us that there were 2 different times where they appeared, one to 10 of the apostles, another to the 11, because Thomas hadn't been present the first time. Verse 15, and he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. He who has believed and has been baptized shall be saved, but he who has disbelieved shall be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents, and they will drink any deadly poison, and it will not hurt them. And they will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. Now, all of those things that Jesus said would happen happened in the book of Acts. Now, he doesn't say it's going to happen to everybody. It doesn't say everybody has to cast out demons, that everybody has to speak in tongues, that everybody has to drink poison, that everybody has to touch snakes. But those things did happen to individuals, to believers, some believers, in the book of Acts. We continue, so then, when the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. Verse 20, and they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word by the signs that followed. And then notice this last section, this last part of the verse I have in brackets. I don't have it. It's actually from the translation. This actually is missing in quite a number of manuscripts, and then there's some that have it, and then there's some that have it in place of the verses that we just read. That is, they have it right after verse 8. So let's read it in any case. And they promptly reported all these instructions to Peter and his companions, and after that Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Now, I don't know almost anyone who believes that that last segment is original to Mark. Very, very possibly what happened, as noted by some very early church fathers, they knew about that long ending, and then somewhere along the lines, it was lost. And people knew, wait a minute, there's more to the story, but we don't have it. And so somebody, from memory or whatever, inserted this little section just to say, this will hold until we can find, maybe it'll turn up again. That longer ending has been lost, but this will be a sort of a summary statement for the time being.